Bible gives us the rules of life and health and salvation and deliverance and so much more. It gives us this inner strength to resist the temptation, to stray away and to walk away. God is a provider to help us flourish. Look at verse 16. But they, our forefathers, became arrogant and stiff-necked and did not obey your commands. They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles. They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked and in their rebellion appointed a leader in order to return to their slavery. This is your memory verse for the week. But you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. Therefore you did not desert them, verse 18. Even when they cast for themselves an image of a calf and said, "This is your God who brought you out of Egypt." Or when they committed awful blasphemies, because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the desert. By day the pillar of cloud did not cease to guide them on their path, nor the pillar of fire by night to shine on the way they were to take. You gave your good spirit to instruct them. You did not withhold your manna from their mouths, and you gave them water for their thirst. For 40 years you sustained them in the desert. They lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out. Imagine that, ladies, for 40 years. Same blouse. They lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, nor did their feet become swollen or have blisters. Verse 22, you gave them kingdoms and nations, allotting to them even the remotest frontiers. They took over the country of Sihon, king of Heshbon, and the country of Og, king of Bashan. You made their sons as numerous as the stars in the sky, and you brought them into the land that you told their fathers to enter and possess. Their sons went in and took possession of the land. You subdued them, the Canaanites. You subdued before them the Canaanites who lived in the land. You handed the Canaanites over to them along with their kings and the peoples of the land to deal with them as they pleased. They captured fortified cities and fertile land. They took possession of houses filled with all kinds of good things, wells already dug, vineyards, olive groves, and fruit trees in abundance. They ate to the full and were well nourished. They reveled in your great goodness. See, God blessed the military endeavors of these Israelites. But let's think for a minute. Weren't they just in 400 years of slavery in Egypt? How many military classes and training do you think they got during that time as slaves in Egypt? Goose egg. They had no military training. They had no military background for 400 years. That's quite a few generations, even when they lived longer back then. You know what I'm saying? There was nothing. There was not, well, I remember my daddy, he did this, so I'm just following his example. His daddy was a slave, his daddy was a slave, and probably his daddy was a slave. All they did was make bricks out of mud. I mean, whatever slaves did, that's what they did. There was no military training, and yet God handed over all of these mammoth countries with kings, strong, because that's no problem for God. Their clothes didn't wear out for 40 years. They didn't have blisters walking around for 40 years. They had the same shoes. My son usually can last about 40 days with his shoes, maybe 4 months. I wear my shoes forever because I don't do anything strenuous, and we'll walk up here on this carpet, and they still maybe will last 4 years, 3 years, 40 years. It's because it's no problem for God. So we see man's stubbornness in the midst of God's repeated blessing. What should have drawn the Israelites to worship and to have humility and gratefulness and loyalty, instead, they became stiff-necked and arrogant and stubborn as an ox. The scriptures say that it's like an ox who is stubborn to guidance. That describe any of you this morning? Have some of you just been flat out guilty of disobeying? Or running from God? Oftentimes it's because we forget what God did in the past. We have forgotten, those of us who are believers, what God has done for many years before this date, because it's It's when we forget what God's done in the past that it leads us to disobedience. It leads us to whining. It leads us to self-pity or rebellion or even worse, doubt, or even the worst, disbelief. We'll just walk away from the faith, all because we stop remembering. But our God continues to forgive. Even in the midst of great sin, you realize they made a golden calf. They took all of their jewelry and rings and watches, or well, probably not a watch at that time, but they took their sundials, their golden sundials. They brought them all in, right? That was a bad one. They brought them all in and put them in a fire and put them in this boiling thing, and then they fashioned a golden calf. And then they had the gall to say, as they sent Moses up, oh, we love God, go up and get the 10 Commandments, it's going to be great. While that's happening, they made this calf and said, this is your God. This is who brought you out of Egypt. Are you kidding me? This golden thing is what provided for us and that our clothes didn't wear out, that we got no blisters on our feet. This thing? And they all worshiped it. If I'd have been God, I'd have got a big, giant, heaven-sized match. Poof. You losers. But God didn't do that. He didn't wipe them out, even while they were getting the 10 Commandments. Despite our failures and disobedience, God keeps forgiving. Despite our sin, God is gracious. Listen now. And despite God's graciousness, we continue to sin. And despite the fact that we continue to sin, God continues to be gracious. May we never, ever be caught calling God out for not being gracious, calling God out for how He treats us. This is the God of the Old Testament. The New Testament backs it up. Romans 5:20. Paul says, but where sin increased, grace increased all the more. But even with all of those blessings that they had to remember, the Israelites fell prey to a self-destructive cycle. We got a lot to read here, verse 20.